Hello and welcome to another episode of Latitude. And in this episode, we're looking at a new set of initiatives, both in New Delhi and in Washington, seem to be targeting clearly China and China's territorial ambitions vis-a-vis India. The Indian cabinet, in an unprecedented move, expressed its desire to strengthen India's ability to more aggressively handle Chinese intrusions along the Himalayan front line. And we had some US senators from the two different political spectrums of the US, but there seems to be increasingly bipartisan support for India and its position vis-a-vis China, expressing their solidarity with India and India's sovereign right and control over Arunachal Pradesh. We have two extremely well-informed and competent guests. We have with us Mr. Iqbal Malhotra, who is the author of many a book, but one particular book in this context is extremely important. His book on the rise of China and China's long-term ambitions, Great Fear. And we have General Dwivedi, who is your classic soldier scholar, has served as India's defense attaché in Beijing, has written a book on the Chinese approach to dealing with India militarily, particularly in the context of the 62 war, and thereafter on how the Chinese perceive things from the other side of the hill. He's now academic who takes lectures, classes, and has a string of degrees to his credit, including a doctorate. So I'll start with you, General Sir. You know the ground very well, having commanded troops on the ground, on the Himalayan front, having looked at the Chinese threat from many different angles. What do you make of the government of India's latest cabinet decision to clear a project by which the tunnel that will link the areas of Ladakh and Kargil through an all-weather tunnel of 4.1 kilometers, the government's decision to enhance, in an unprecedented move, the strength of the Indo-Tibetan border police by some 9,400 personnel, which is in excess of what a division is in the army, and also to provide support for projects which will make the locals along the Sino-Indian front line stay on in their homes and not leave them for want of educational facilities or health facilities. Now, is this an outcome of the recent Chinese efforts to try and intrude in Yangtze area of Arunachal Pradesh? Or is this an outcome of an ongoing project in Delhi to steadily enhance India's capabilities to handle Chinese intrusions?
Well, Maruf, firstly, always a pleasure to be on the Latitude and to do show with you. Well, I think you have raised a very pertinent question, and this debate also is very timely because we need to take a absolute relook as to what are the Chinese designs and what should be our responses. You know, right from 1950, the Chinese designs are very clear. They wanted to have very secure periphery, and that's why they invested a lot in Tibet and Xinjiang. And when they wanted to connect these two frontline states to the Western Highway, that is G219, which passed through Exechin, and that was one of the main reasons for the 62 war. But coming closer to the 21st century, well, Chinese, animosity, hostility has been there because our strategic interests are not in sync. They are rather in collusion. But I will come to 2012, which was a defining year for the Chinese Communist Party. When Xi Jinping came to power, well, he very clearly stated that China is past the stage of hide and bite, and China now needs to emerge as a global power. And that what actually led to aggression, coercion, and Chinese actually coming very openly to sort out the territorial disputes. And that's why we see sting of events, like Depsan in 2013, Doklam in 2017, and then you rightly said In 2020, we had a massive incursion by about 3 divisions in Ladakh. I think at this time, India had possibly no option because we had tried to underplay Chinese threat. We had also diplomatic tried to appease Chinese, but now the time had come when the push has come to shove, and India had to take a considered stand, and this had to be in multiple directions. Politically, rightly you brought out that we are now more inclined, more in sync with the Western strategic thinking, like Quad, and lately, as you said, that the American senators have come out very openly in bipartisan approach. Secondly, we also have taken now strides in developing the infrastructure, especially Ladakh, Shinkun
Okay.
tunnel will connect Ladakh to the hinterland because the Gila tunnel is going to take long time. And we also built the, DBO, Shok, Darbuk road. We also now building the road from Chishul to Dimchok, where all I have served. So, and also same thing is happening in Arunachal Pradesh. Same.
Oh, my question is, we are aware this is all happening, but what is really pushing us to suddenly speed up all this? I haven't noticed this extra effort or extra decisiveness on the part of the cabinet to enhance all these things in the last 2 years. So why now?
Maru, because after 2020, despite one-on-one meeting with Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, still Chinese have gone on to undertake major aggressive. And that shows the Chinese attitude that they are not going to relent. So
Okay.
therefore, India has no option but to respond very resolutely and robustly. And that response can come only when we have good infrastructure, when we have adequate deployment, and also when we are managing our borders by having
Okay.
border villages and
Okay.
also enhance ITBP strength. Maru.
Yes. So you covered that, my question now in the last part of your answer. I'll go to Iqbal Chand Malhotra, who is author, expert, and observer, in a way par excellence, of the Chinese mind. And I want you, Iqbal, to explain to us that what do you think the Chinese are going to react with when it sees infrastructure development on the Indian front lines and it sees so much of congressional support for India's position, particularly with reference to the McMahon line, which more or less now the American politicians at least have given a signal of approval of, that is very much, in the words of Jawaharlal Nehru, map or no map, that is our border. Your view?
Maruf, my view is that the Indian government is getting adequate intelligence from the US, particularly after we signed the fourth foundation agreement, BECA, in October 2020. And indications are that there is a war looming on the horizon. The war is going to the war is started in the Ukraine. And there is a choice now for President Biden, after he's made that very dramatic trip to Kiev, that he has to confront both the Chinese and the Russians, because the Chinese cannot let Putin's government collapse, because that would bring a pro-Western government to power in Moscow. And that would be disastrous for the Chinese. And Biden cannot let the war continue and Ukraine to collapse with the supply of armaments and weapons from the Chinese. So the minute it is established beyond doubt that the Chinese are supplying weapons to the Russians, I think Biden will then authorize the release of the Soviet-era fighters in the NATO air forces, which are ready to be transferred to Ukraine, and there'll be an escalation of the war. So what is happening is that the world is moving into a division between two camps. The US and the EU on one side, along with Japan, Australia, Singapore, and South Korea, and the Chinese, Russians, Iranians, Pakistanis, and North Koreans on the other side. And clearly, the Americans want to make sure that India doesn't sit on the fence and is firmly in their camp. And they keep on pointing to the dangers that we face from the Chinese and the provocations that the Chinese continue to do. and all this salami slicing that is going on. Also, the Chinese are eyeing the waters of the Indus Cascade, the Indus River, the Changchemo, the Nubra, the Shyok, and the Galwan River, because their $30 billion project on in POK on the Indus to build the two dams to supply northern China with electricity, water, and to kickstart their new microchip factories in Xinjiang await completion. So, I mean, we are willy-nilly poised for a confrontation, whether this gets diffused, whether it gets resolved, or whether it becomes a hot kinetic war. Time will only tell.
Okay, just a quick additional question to you, since you are on the flow now. What is it that the Chinese would settle for along the McMahon line as a kind of agreed departure point from what is our position and their position?
But you see, the Chinese have already moved their forces in 2020 up to the 1959 claim line, and they are unlikely to move them back. They are looking for I mean, this is my view. It's a completely heretic view, but my view is that they are there on the borders, our borders in eastern Ladakh, in division strength, and they're in permanent structures because they're looking to dominate physically the flow of the river Indus.
Yeah, but I want to know McMahon line. McMahon line is the one which the Americans seem to have also passed a kind of comment on, and you know, the American senators are all in support
because
of
they're
that.
putting pressure on us. They did that in 1962 as well, when Chow En Lai proposed a territory swap. He said, we'll recognize the McMahon line in Arunachal, provided you give us Eastern Ladakh. Now, they needed Eastern Ladakh because they needed the Karkash River, the waters, the Karkash River, and the uranium deposits in Aksai Chin, which they have been mining for the last 50 years. So these are strategic ploys, put pressure on one side so that we concede ground on the other side.
Okay, so, well, you've answered my question, because that's what my view also is, that put pressure on one side so that you focus on the other side, what in military terms we call a feint or a distraction. But I'll come back after a break to look at one or two other issues which are important in the context of the situation that's building up between India and China, but that after a break. We are continuing to have our two experts on the show. We have Mr. Iqbal Chand Malhotra, author, and somebody who's looked at in great detail about the rise of communist China and what is the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party, and also in the context of how does it play out with India. And we have General Dwivedi, who is a soldier scholar, has done a lot of work on issues of international affairs. His hands-on experience on looking at Sino-Indian ties, both as our defense attaché in Beijing and also as commander of Indian troops on the Himalayan front line. So, General Dwivedi, sir, Chinese troops recently, some months ago, tried to make another incursion and capture Yangtze. Yangtze, as you know from your practical experience, is an important high ground, but a plateaued high ground, which control of which will give them a certain amount of extra edge in dealing with our troops and our deployments along Namkachu or even the adjoining areas. What is it that is so different about Yangtze vis-a-vis Tawang, which they have traditionally cited as belonging to southern Tibet and therefore belongs to China? And how does this play into our sovereign claims over Arunachal? And could that be the flashpoint?
Well, Maruf, we got to take a holistic look as far as the Indo-Chinese border dispute is concerned. It cannot be seen in packets or in these sectors. It has to be taken in totality. First and foremost point is that Chinese are not keen to solve the border issue, because that's one pressure point they can always bring upon us at the time and place of their own choosing. And so they decide whether to do it in Ladakh or whether to do in Arunachal Pradesh. Secondly, if strategically you see both Eastern Ladakh and Arunachal are strategically very important, because for Chinese, and last year Xi Jinping was in Lhasa, and he was addressed to all these PLA and other civilian, authorities there. They said we need to make, Tibet as a shield. So therefore, to defend Tibet, they need to ingress into Arunachal Pradesh because that's what gives the strategic depth. And therefore, they always are on lookout for the vulnerabilities like we had Doklam, now we had Yangtze in Tawang sector, sometimes it be Fishtail area. So they will constantly keep, nibbling. And I call it nibble and negotiate strategy. So Chinese are not keen to sort out the border issue. They want to ensure that wherever they are vulnerable, they like to strengthen their position and keep enhancing their defensive posture. And the very important point is that Chinese are now engaged in gray zone warfare, that is, three warfares, which is psychological, legal, and propaganda. So recently, last year, they also made a border, law in which they demarcated the border areas, renamed a couple of places in Arunachal Pradesh, only trying to project that they have the legal claim on this territory. So, in nutshell, what I would say that Chinese are looking for opportunities wherever they're vulnerable, they're strengthening them, and we need to take a total look at the border with China, not see Eastern Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh from the two different lenses. They got to be seen together, and we got to improve our defensive posture both by way of infrastructure, by having better border management, and also at the political level, we must be seen with all our friends who would back us up in case this conflict takes in further escalation or Chinese try to further coerce us on the border issue.
So I just want to understand one quick point from you, that are you suggesting that we just keep beefing up our military capacities and other infrastructure development there, and that the Chinese are not looking for a settlement on the border issue? So there's no point worrying too much about a settlement. Just be prepared for a Chinese attack. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I am not saying that we should be so sort of imminently see Chinese attack. As I said, Chinese will not likely to engage in a major fight, but small actions have strategic ramification. You take Doklam, you take Galwan, they have a global ramification. The point I'm trying to make is that Chinese will keep making an effort to strengthen their posture on the border and keep exploiting the vulnerability. We don't have to do only responses. I think we need to be more proactive by taking certain actions where we can hurt the Chinese and not only respond. And more importantly, today, we got to ensure the sovereignty of our territorial integrity, not to yield any ground. And for that, we got to be very strong in our border management posture.
Okay, so understood, sir. Understood. Now, Iqbal, I want you to give me a more holistic geopolitical understanding of where we stand with China. You have American senators, though it's not gone to vote, but you have bipartisan support there where they have moved a resolution to show that Arunachal is very much part of Indian territory and that the McMahon line is very much the boundary between India and China on India's northeast. There has been no comment of this very nature about Ladakh, Aksai Chin, etc. So they're just focusing on that region. That's one. The second thing is that America repeatedly is having all sorts of engagements. It's now being suggested that there could be at least 2, if not 3 or 4 meetings between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden this year. The G20 summit meeting and the Quad meeting. At the same time, Mr. Modi is probably slated for a state guest visit to the US. So things are going upwards between India and the US. But the US has not yet given a formal commitment, as it has given in the case of Taiwan, that if there is a Chinese attack on Indian territory, and India, as you know, is the only Quad country which is facing China front up on the borders, the rest of them on the high seas and not really clearly spelling out what their agenda is. Everyone knows they're against China, but there are no red lines that have been spelled out as yet, except for South China Sea. So where do you see India going? Is it India that needs to prepare all on its own for a situation like this? Or is it that India is actually being assured quietly with whispers from Washington to say, stick it out, we'll stand with you, as Maggie Thatcher did for Kuwait just before the Iraqi invasion?
Maruf, my view is this, that, India in the 21st century and in 2023 has still not been able to shake off the Nehruvian concept of non-alignment, which has been given a new avatar today, and it's called strategic autonomy. The Americans are not going to give you a guarantee to protect you fully against the Chinese unless you become a political and military ally of the Americans. And you cannot play both sides. You cannot play the Russian side and you cannot play the American side. And playing the Russian side means you're also de facto aligning with the nefarious characters like Pakistan and North Korea. I'm not calling the Iranians nefarious. But the fact of the matter is this, that, the world is now, as I said earlier on, the world is being divided into two camps. We have to choose. Either we choose America and the EU. I mean, we have political relationships with Britain. There's an Indian origin prime minister in Britain. There is an Indian origin vice president in America. There is an Indian origin lady who's going to stand for the Republican nomination, Nikki Haley. So, I mean, we have more in common with America than we have with China. So I think this Chinese thing has to be abandoned, this appeasement towards China. If you look at what has happened since Mr. George Fernandez identified China as the reason why we went nuclear way back in 1998, we see that the Chinese have crippled our industries. We are unable to provide employment because our industries like pharmaceuticals, metal manufacture, chemical engineering have all shut down because it was cheaper to make products in China. So the Chinese have been strangling our industrial capacities, strangling our economy, and politically pushing us towards a settlement in Kashmir, which no Indian government so far has the mandate to do. We cannot yield any territory to China because it suits them to gain dominion and control over the Indus River and its tributaries. And that is what Mr. Xi Jinping was after during his last summit with Prime Minister Modi in Mamlapuram in October 2019. Yeah. Because 4 months later, he began moving his armies in when Mr. Modi didn't agree to his terms. So when he began moving his armies in February towards India, what did the Russians do? The Russians betrayed us in April 2020 by giving us a false sense of assurance that the Chinese are not doing any maneuvers and they're just doing military exercises. And then they forced us to sign that agreement in September 15, 2020, whereby we agreed not to go back to the status quo ante. So that means to say that we have accepted the Chinese 1959 claim line as the de facto LAC in Eastern Ladakh.
Okay.
So, I mean, the situation is that we need to choose a side and we need to beef up our position politically as well as militarily.
So, well, thanks. It's a very comprehensive and a very powerful answer. And I'm sure those who are going to be listening to you in South Block will at least know that there is somebody who will stand up for them and support them when South Block decides to lean towards Washington more openly. At the same time, I'm sure the Russian ambassador in India will not be very pleased to hear your answers. But for the moment, we are completely out of time. I think we've got a reasonably good picture about where we need to be going, what we need to be strengthening, and where we expect our friends to come in if the world wants us, in the name of democracy, to be part of an American-led grouping which challenges the autocratic rulers of Beijing and Moscow. How that will pan out is a matter of time, and which choice India will make, or will it continue to be a swing state, we'll have to see. Thank you very much for your views, and thanks to all of you for watching.